The moment I realized my marriage was already over happened in a grocery store parking lot, with my phone vibrating in my hand and my wife's voice coming through the speaker saying another man's name the way she never said mine anymore, soft and amused and unguarded, like she had forgotten that the world could still hear her. I stood there with melting ice cream dripping through the bag, listening to a message that was never meant for me, and what hit me wasn't the confirmation of sex or even the betrayal itself, but the terrifying calm in her tone, the way she spoke as if this was not a mistake or a secret but a routine she had rehearsed long before I ever suspected anything was wrong. I didn't confront her that night because something inside me broke too quietly for shouting, and I remember sitting on the edge of our bed later while she slept beside me, her phone glowing with notifications that she had muted so carefully, and I realized that this wasn't an impulsive affair driven by loneliness or alcohol or bad decisions, but a structure built behind my back with time, patience, and intention. Every late meeting, every sudden gym session, every emotional distance I blamed on stress now aligned into a picture that made me feel stupid for ever believing love alone could protect me from being strategically replaced. The next days passed in a strange haze where I played my role so convincingly that even I almost believed it again, and during that time I learned everything I could about him without leaving fingerprints, finding his name through a synced contact, his workplace through casual mentions she thought meant nothing, and eventually his social media where he smiled next to a woman who had no idea her life was quietly being dismantled by two people who believed they were smarter than everyone else. He looked successful in a way that felt curated rather than earned, confident in a way that suggested he had never been forced to look at himself honestly. And when I saw the wedding ring on his hand in one photo and the way his wife leaned into him like safety was something she could still count on, something shifted inside me that felt colder than anger and far more focused. Reaching out to her wasn't part of a revenge fantasy at first, because at that point, I didn't even know what revenge would look like. But the first message I sent was wrapped in politeness and plausible deniability, framed as a coincidence tied to work and mutual acquaintances. And when she responded with cautious warmth and a subtle undertone of exhaustion that I recognized immediately, I understood that this was not a woman living in blissful ignorance, but someone who had already begun asking herself questions she was afraid to answer. Our first conversation stretched longer than either of us planned, moving carefully around topics that felt dangerous, and there was something intimate about the way she chose her words, as if she was testing whether honesty would finally be safe with someone who had nothing to gain from lying to her. When we compared details days later, doing it slowly and methodically like people handling something fragile, the timelines didn't just overlap, but interlocked so perfectly that denial became impossible. And the more we talked, the more I noticed how her voice softened when she wasn't defending him, how her laughter carried relief rather than joy, and how my own bitterness was being met not with judgment but with recognition. There was tension in the pauses between messages, in the way we both avoided acknowledging the obvious pull forming beneath the shared pain, and when we finally met in person under the excuse of clarity, the electricity between us felt less like lust and more like being seen after months of invisibility. Crossing the line didn't happen dramatically or suddenly, because it began as a decision not to stop what was already unfolding, a quiet agreement that we deserved to feel chosen again, even if the circumstances were messy and morally undefined. And sitting across from her in a dim bar while she held my gaze longer than necessary, I felt something awaken that had been dormant for years. When she leaned closer and said in a steady voice that she was tired of being loyal to people who treated loyalty like a weakness, the weight of my marriage finally collapsed inward, and what followed was charged with restraint and longing rather than recklessness, the kind of closeness that carries intention and consequence in equal measure. It was only later, after the guilt and adrenaline settled into something more deliberate, that she told me the truth with a calm that made my stomach drop, explaining that she had known about the affair long before I ever reached out, that she had watched and waited and collected proof because reacting too early would have cost her everything she had spent years building. As she spoke, I understood that I hadn't initiated revenge at all, but had unknowingly stepped into a plan already in motion, and sitting there with the realization that I was no longer the most calculated person in the room, I felt something close to respect mix uncomfortably with the desire and anger that had brought us together in the first place. I thought knowing the truth would calm me down, but what it really did was sharpen everything, because once you stop wondering whether you're being lied to, your mind suddenly has room to focus on who is doing the lying and how far they've gone to protect themselves. After that first night, after her confession that she had known long before I ever reached out, I couldn't sleep, not because of guilt or excitement, but because my head kept replaying the same question over and over again, asking how a man could live two lives so comfortably that neither woman ever saw the seams. That question pulled me deeper into his world, and I started digging not like a jealous husband looking for reasons to explode, but like someone studying an enemy, calm, patient, and disturbingly curious. Everything about him was clean on the surface, the kind of clean that only exists when someone has had years to polish their image, because his professional life was full of awards, smiling team photos, and carefully worded posts about leadership and values that made my jaw tighten every time I read them. He talked publicly about integrity and balance, about how family grounded him, and every word felt like it had been written specifically to mock the reality I now knew was hiding underneath. I learned his routines without trying too hard, because people like him leave trails everywhere when they believe they're untouchable. And the more I watched, the more obvious it became that he was used to winning, used to people admiring him, and completely unprepared for the idea that anyone might be quietly keeping score. What bothered me most wasn't even the affair anymore, but the arrogance behind it, the assumption that his wife would never notice, that my wife would never talk, and that I would either remain clueless or collapse loudly if I ever found out, making myself the problem while he walked away intact. I remember telling her during one of our long conversations that he reminded me of a man who had never faced consequences he couldn't talk his way out of, and she laughed softly before saying that was exactly how he handled conflict at home, with charm and selective honesty, always just enough truth to reset the balance without ever changing his behavior. As days passed, our communication grew more intentional, not flirtatious in an obvious way, but heavy with subtext. And when she told me stories about their marriage that mirrored my own experiences so closely it felt rehearsed, something inside me hardened. She described how he would disappear emotionally for weeks, how questions were met with reassurance instead of answers, and how every instinct she had learned to trust was slowly trained to doubt itself, and hearing it from the other side made my own past arguments suddenly click into place. We weren't dealing with two separate affairs, but one carefully maintained ecosystem of deception, designed to keep everyone slightly off balance while he stayed firmly in control. I began noticing how my wife spoke differently now that I knew what to listen for, how her words were calculated to keep me stable but distant, how affection was rationed like a resource rather than shared, and once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. During dinner one night, when she casually mentioned his name as part of a story meant to sound harmless, I watched her face closely and realized she wasn't nervous at all, because in her mind, the risks were already managed. That realization didn't make me angry in the explosive sense, but it did something worse because it convinced me that confronting her would only end the story in a way that benefited them both. What surprised me was how natural it felt to talk to his wife about all of this, because with her there was no performance, no need to pretend I was fine or reasonable or understanding. And when she said she felt foolish for staying silent for so long, I told her the truth without softening it, explaining that silence wasn't weakness, but strategy, and that patience had already given her more power than she realized. There was tension in those conversations that had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with recognition, the kind that makes you lean closer even when you know you should step back, because someone is finally speaking your language. By the end of that week, the idea of revenge no longer felt like a dramatic outburst waiting to happen, but like a process already underway, shaped by observation and restraint rather than impulse, and I understood that the man who had taken my marriage for granted had no idea how exposed he already was. As I lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling while my wife slept peacefully beside me, I realized that the most dangerous thing about this situation wasn't the betrayal itself, but the fact that I had stopped reacting and started planning, and that whatever came next would not be loud or immediate, but deliberate, precise, and impossible for him to explain away once it finally unfolded. The first time we spoke on the phone instead of hiding behind text, it felt like stepping into a room where the air was already warm from a conversation that had been happening without me, and the sound of her voice carried a steadiness that made it impossible to treat this like a casual exchange between strangers. She didn't start by accusing or crying or demanding explanations, because by then she was past that phase, and instead she asked me to tell her exactly how I had figured it out, listening in a way that suggested she was assembling something in her mind piece by piece rather than reacting emotionally. When I finished, there was a pause long enough to make me think the call had dropped, and then she said quietly that everything I described matched moments she had dismissed for months, and hearing someone finally confirm her instincts sounded like relief mixed with grief. We met a few days later under the excuse of practicality, choosing a neutral place where neither of us felt like we were trespassing, and when she walked in, I understood immediately why he had been so careless, because she had a presence that didn't demand attention but commanded it once you noticed. She wasn't dressed to impress or provoke, yet there was an ease in the way she moved that made the space around her feel smaller, and as we sat across from each other, the conversation flowed with an honesty that made time irrelevant. She told me about the early years of their marriage, about promises that had felt sincere then, and about the slow erosion that came from being constantly reassured while nothing actually changed. And as she spoke, I realized how deeply loneliness can coexist with companionship when someone is determined to keep you just content enough not to leave. There was a moment when our knees brushed under the table, accidental but not immediately corrected, and the awareness of it sent a quiet jolt through me that had nothing to do with novelty and everything to do with recognition. She noticed it too, because her voice faltered for a second before she continued, and in that brief silence there was an understanding that something had shifted, something neither of us named because naming it would have forced a decision we weren't ready to make. Instead, we leaned into the shared task of aligning timelines and details, comparing dates and trips and excuses, and the more we spoke, the clearer it became that the lies weren't spontaneous but rehearsed, designed to be believable precisely because they were recycled across different audiences. What struck me was how calm she remained while laying it all out, not because she didn't care, but because she had already burned through the phase of panic alone, and now she was operating from a place of clarity that felt almost intimidating. When I asked her why she hadn't confronted him sooner, she looked at me steadily and explained that confrontation only benefits the person with more to hide, because it gives them time to adjust and rewrite the story, and that waiting had allowed her to see the full pattern rather than fragments. Hearing that reframed my own silence not as cowardice, but as alignment with a strategy I hadn't consciously chosen, and the respect I felt for her then complicated the attraction simmering beneath the surface. As the evening stretched on, the conversation drifted from logistics into something more personal, touching on what it felt like to be wanted again, even hypothetically. And when she admitted that she missed being looked at without suspicion or expectation, I felt the words settle heavily between us. I told her I had forgotten what it was like to speak freely without measuring my tone to avoid conflict, and the way she smiled at that made it clear she understood exactly what I meant. There was restraint in the space between us, charged and deliberate, and when we finally stood to leave, the hug we shared lingered just long enough to cross from polite into intimate without ever becoming inappropriate. Driving home that night, I realized that the first contact had changed the shape of everything, because it had turned abstract betrayal into a shared reality, one where I was no longer alone in carrying the weight of what had been done to us. I wasn't thinking about revenge yet in concrete terms, but I was aware of a growing sense of momentum, fueled not by rage but by connection. And as I slipped back into bed beside my wife, her familiar presence now felt distant in a way that was irreversible. Lying there in the dark, replaying the cadence of another woman's voice in my mind, I understood that the most dangerous thing that had happened wasn't the affair itself, but the fact that I had found someone who saw the truth as clearly as I did, and wasn't afraid of where that truth might eventually lead us. By the time we admitted we were talking every night, it already felt dishonest to pretend this was still about gathering information, because the conversations had taken on a rhythm that went far beyond logistics, stretching late into the hours when defenses drop and people stop editing themselves. We compared notes at first with discipline, lining up dates and excuses and noticing how often the same phrases appeared in different contexts, as if he had a limited script he reused whenever pressure threatened to crack his composure, and each match tightened something in my chest that felt like clarity replacing confusion. She would pause occasionally, taking a breath before continuing, and I could hear the effort it took not to let years of frustration spill over into anger. And when I told her how my wife had mirrored those same deflections almost word for word, she laughed quietly and said that men like him didn't improvise, they optimized. That shared understanding created a sense of alignment that felt dangerous in its own way, because once you realize someone else sees the pattern as clearly as you do, it becomes difficult to pretend you're still on separate paths. Our alliance formed without ceremony, shaped by mutual restraint rather than excitement, and we were careful not to frame it as revenge, even though that was the direction it naturally leaned toward, because neither of us wanted to give him the satisfaction of being central to our decisions. Instead, we spoke about boundaries and timing, about what exposure would cost and who it would benefit, and in those conversations I felt a pull that had nothing to do with the subject matter and everything to do with the way she listened. There was a steadiness in her responses that made me feel grounded rather than fueled, and when our discussions drifted into what we had both missed most about being desired, the shift was subtle, but undeniable. She admitted she had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without expectation, to be seen without being assessed, and when I said that I had started to feel invisible even while sharing a bed, the silence that followed was thick with recognition rather than awkwardness, and neither of us rushed to break it. The night we finally crossed from alliance into something more was unremarkable on the surface, marked by a conversation that stretched too long in a moment where neither of us suggested ending it, and what made it powerful was how deliberate it felt, rather than impulsive. We didn't frame it as payback or escape, but as permission to acknowledge the connection that had been building quietly while we pretended not to notice. And when she said that choosing this felt honest in a way her marriage hadn't for years, I understood that we were no longer just reacting to what had been done to us. The attraction between us carried restraint, an awareness of consequences that sharpened rather than dulled the tension. And when we finally met again with that understanding unspoken but present, every glance and pause felt charged with intention. Walking away afterward, I felt something shift decisively, because the alliance was no longer just strategic but personal, and as I returned home to a marriage that now felt hollow in comparison, I knew that whatever came next would be shaped not by anger alone, but by the quiet certainty that I was no longer willing to play a role designed for someone else's convenience. By the time we reached the point where pretending restraint still mattered, the line between intention and action had already thinned into something almost symbolic, because the real crossing happened internally, long before anything physical followed. We talked openly about not exposing them yet, framing it as patience and leverage, but underneath that logic was a quieter truth. Neither of us said out loud at first, which was that delaying the confrontation allowed us to exist in a space where we were chosen deliberately rather than by default. There was an intimacy in that decision that felt heavier than sex, because it required trust, timing, and a shared willingness to sit with discomfort instead of rushing toward relief. When we met again, it wasn't planned as a turning point, yet everything about the evening carried that weight, from the way she held my gaze a second longer than necessary to the calm certainty in her voice when she said she was tired of reacting and wanted, just once, to act on her own terms. We talked for hours, circling the obvious without naming it, discussing boundaries we both knew were already bending, and when I finally admitted that I wanted to feel chosen without conditions or apologies, she didn't flinch or deflect. She said she understood exactly what that hunger felt like, because she had spent years being tolerated rather than desired. And hearing that reflected back at me stripped away whatever illusions I still had about returning to the way things were. Crossing the line happened without spectacle, marked more by closeness and intention than by heat. And what surprised me was how controlled it felt, how present we both were in a moment that could have easily tipped into chaos. There was attraction, undeniable and charged, but also an undercurrent of mutual respect that made it feel less like a reckless escape and more like a conscious choice to stop denying what had already been true for weeks. When she rested her head against my shoulder afterward and said quietly that this wasn't about revenge anymore, I believed her, because the satisfaction I felt wasn't rooted in imagining their reaction, but in the simple relief of no longer lying to myself. It was later, when the room had settled into that reflective calm that follows decisions you know you won't undo, that she told me the part of the story she had been holding back, and the shift in her tone made me sit up immediately. She explained, without drama or apology, that she had known about the affair long before I ever appeared in her messages, that the signs had been there for over a year, and that confronting him early would have cost her financially and emotionally in ways she wasn't prepared to accept. Instead, she had watched, documented, and waited, building leverage quietly while he grew more careless. And when she looked at me and said that my message hadn't started the process but had simply accelerated it, I felt something settle in my chest that was equal parts shock and clarity. Realizing that I hadn't initiated the revenge but had stepped into a plan already in motion forced me to reevaluate my role entirely, because I wasn't the architect I thought I was, but neither was I a pawn. She told me she had been waiting for the right alignment of truth and opportunity, and that what we shared wasn't manipulation, but convergence. Two people arriving independently at the same decision to stop absorbing damage silently. There was something unsettling and grounding in that revelation, because it stripped away the illusion that this was a spontaneous reaction to betrayal and replaced it with the understanding that patience could be far more destructive than rage. As I left that night, the weight of what I had learned followed me home, and lying beside my wife, listening to her breathe, I felt the final piece click into place. I hadn't crossed a line in a moment of weakness, but in recognition of a reality that had already been set in motion long before I ever chose to see it, and the knowledge that I was now part of something deliberate and irreversible didn't fill me with guilt or triumph. Instead, it brought a calm certainty that whatever happened next would not be an accident, not a reaction, but the result of two people who had finally decided to stop waiting for permission to reclaim control over their own lives. Once the truth was fully on the table, the energy between us shifted from emotional intensity into something colder and more precise, because understanding that she had already been preparing for this long before I arrived reframed everything we were about to do. The trap wasn't born out of rage or impulse, but out of patience, and what made it effective was how ordinary it looked from the outside, because nothing about it required sudden moves or dramatic confrontations. We talked through every detail slowly, mapping habits and routines, identifying which lies were reused most often, and which excuses appeared whenever pressure increased. And the more we planned, the clearer it became that the cheaters' greatest weakness was their confidence that they were invisible. They believed discretion meant safety, and that belief had made them lazy. We started documenting everything without changing our behavior, which was the most important part, because exposure only works when the subjects believe they're still in control. Messages were archived, screenshots time-stamped, calendars quietly synced, and stories cross-referenced until patterns emerged so clearly that they almost felt insulting in their simplicity. She explained how she had already consulted quietly with a lawyer months earlier, how financial records had been copied, how accounts and passwords had been secured without triggering suspicion, and listening to her speak with such calm authority made me realize how underestimated she had been in her own marriage. My role was different, but just as deliberate, because staying emotionally neutral at home allowed my wife to remain careless. And I learned quickly how easy it was to keep someone comfortable when they believed the worst had already been avoided. There were moments during that phase when the tension between us resurfaced unexpectedly, usually late at night when exhaustion lowered our guard and the weight of secrecy pressed in from all sides, but even that energy was folded back into the plan rather than distracting from it. We understood instinctively that the power we were building came from restraint, from letting anticipation replace reaction, And when she told me that the most damaging thing we could do was allow them to feel safe, right up until the moment they weren't, I knew we were aligned in a way that went beyond shared hurt. This wasn't about humiliating them in private or lashing out emotionally, but about controlling the narrative so completely that there would be no space left for denial or reinterpretation. Execution required timing rather than force, and we waited until their lives were at peak stability, when careers were visible, social circles active, and family dynamics publicly intact, because collapse only matters when there is something solid to fall from. The messages were released simultaneously to the right people, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because selective exposure would have allowed spin, and spin was the one thing we couldn't permit. Watching the reactions unfold from a distance was surreal, not because it felt triumphant, but because it was so quiet, so procedural, like watching a machine complete the task it had been designed for. My wife's shock was genuine, his panic immediate, and the speed with which their confidence evaporated confirmed everything we had assumed about how fragile their control really was. When the dust began to rise, I felt an unexpected stillness settle in, because carrying out the plan hadn't filled me with adrenaline or satisfaction in the way I once imagined revenge would, but with a sense of inevitability that felt almost relieving. We had acted with clarity rather than cruelty, and there was no room left for them to claim confusion or victimhood, because every step had been documented with their own words and choices. Sitting alone that night, replaying the sequence in my mind, I understood that the trap hadn't been about punishing them for what they did, but about ending their ability to pretend it hadn't happened at all, and that realization carried a weight far heavier than any confrontation ever could. The exposure didn't arrive like an explosion, but like a sudden loss of gravity, a moment where everything they had been floating on simply disappeared at once, and what made it unbearable to watch was how quickly their practiced confidence collapsed into incoherence. The messages went out within minutes of each other, carefully timed and worded so that no one received partial truth or softened context, and as my phone began to vibrate with missed calls and unread messages, I felt detached in a way I hadn't expected, as if I were observing someone else's life being dismantled according to a plan I had memorized but no longer needed to think about. My wife called first, her voice unsteady and sharp at the same time as she demanded to know what I had done, and when I told her calmly that I had stopped lying for her convenience and that the truth now belonged to everyone she had used as cover, the silence on the other end felt heavier than any shouting could have been. He tried next, which almost made me laugh, because the audacity of it confirmed everything I already knew about how he saw the world, and when I answered, his voice came through strained but controlled, asking if we could talk like adults and sort this out privately before things got out of hand. I told him that things were already out of hand the moment he decided secrecy was a substitute for accountability, and when he shifted tactics, lowering his voice and suggesting misunderstandings and coincidences, I interrupted him and said that explanations were only useful before evidence existed, not after. He went quiet then, and in that pause I could almost hear him recalculating, searching for leverage that no longer existed, and when he finally spoke again, it was to ask what I wanted, as if this were a negotiation rather than an ending, and I told him the truth without embellishment, explaining that I didn't want anything from him except distance and silence. The reaction spread outward exactly as we anticipated, because people are far less unpredictable when the narrative is complete, and watching mutual friends and colleagues begin to ask questions publicly stripped away the protective ambiguity he had relied on for years. My wife's attempts to regain control were clumsy, swinging between anger and vulnerability, and when she confronted me in person, standing in our kitchen with tears she couldn't quite summon on command, she told me that I had humiliated her and destroyed our life without warning. I listened without interrupting, and when she finished, I said evenly that humiliation requires innocence, and that what she was experiencing was exposure, and the distinction mattered, because it meant the consequences belonged to her choices rather than my response. She stared at me then, as if trying to find the version of me who would soften that statement, and when she realized he wasn't coming back, that there would be no dramatic reconciliation or secret repair, something in her expression hardened into something colder and more calculating. What unsettled me most wasn't the chaos itself, but how quickly it normalized, because within days the shock gave way to logistics, and conversations shifted from accusations to damage control, revealing how transactional everything had been beneath the surface. She asked about timelines and property and public perception, not about reconciliation or understanding, and in that shift I saw clearly that the marriage she claimed to mourn had already been dismantled long before I ever intervened. His wife, meanwhile, moved with a decisiveness that bordered on surgical, filing what needed to be filed and informing who needed to be informed, and when we spoke during that period, her voice carried neither triumph nor regret, only relief at no longer carrying the burden of pretending. She told me she felt lighter now that the truth was no longer confined to her head, and hearing that mirrored my own experience so closely that it grounded me when the surrounding noise threatened to pull me back into reaction. By the end of that week, the exposure had settled into a new reality where apologies arrived too late to matter, and explanations sounded hollow even to the people offering them. And as I stood alone in a space that already felt less like home, I understood that the most profound consequence wasn't the collapse of their image, but the clarity that followed. Revenge, if that's what this was, didn't feel like victory or closure, but like a door closing firmly behind me, cutting off any path back to the version of my life built on compromise and denial. In that quiet aftermath, surrounded by the debris of truths finally spoken aloud, I felt something unexpected take shape. Not satisfaction or pride, but a steady awareness that the story was no longer theirs to control, and that whatever came next would be defined not by what had been taken from me, but by what I no longer needed to protect. The silence that followed the exposure was heavier than the chaos that preceded it, because once the calls slowed and the messages turned from panic into negotiation, I was left alone with the realization that revenge doesn't echo the way you imagine it will. My wife oscillated between remorse and accusation with exhausting speed, sitting across from me at the dining table as if proximity alone might restore leverage, telling me in long, carefully shaped sentences that she never meant to hurt me, and that things had simply gotten complicated, that emotions blurred and mistakes snowballed, and that if I had just spoken up earlier, none of this would have gone so far. I listened without interrupting, noticing how her explanations were structured to soften responsibility rather than confront it, and when she finally asked if I felt better now that I had ruined everything, I realized with a dull ache that there was no answer she would accept, because what she wanted wasn't truth or resolution, but relief from consequences. He unraveled faster than I expected, not in public where appearances still mattered, but privately where the collapse was complete, sending messages that shifted from indignation to pleading as he tried to salvage fragments of control. In one conversation that stretched far longer than it needed to, he told me that affairs didn't always mean the end of a marriage, and that people made allowances when they understood context. And hearing him speak with such confidence about forgiveness made it clear that he had never once considered the possibility that he wouldn't be the one deciding how this ended. I told him calmly that context doesn't erase intent, and that forgiveness isn't something you argue your way into. And when he asked whether there was any version of this where I would help him contain the damage, I said that containment had been his priority from the beginning, and that I had no interest in maintaining a system designed to protect him. Despite everything unfolding exactly as planned, an emptiness settled in that I hadn't anticipated, because the exposure resolved the injustice but didn't restore what had been taken, and sitting alone in the evenings now that the house felt unfamiliar, I wondered whether this was the natural cost of clarity. It was during one of those quiet nights, when my wife was away staying with a friend, and the space around me felt stripped of pretense, that I stumbled across the final truth not through investigation but through a careless confession she didn't realize was one. We spoke on the phone about logistics, about separation and timelines, and how we would explain things to people who didn't yet know the full story. And in a moment of frustration, she said something that froze me completely, explaining that she never expected the affair to last, and that it had been a way to force a confrontation she didn't have the courage to initiate directly. I asked her to repeat herself, keeping my voice steady even as something inside me tightened, and she clarified in a rush of words that she had wanted out of the marriage for over a year, but didn't want to be the one who left, because leaving meant being judged and blamed and remembered as the person who broke things. Cheating, she explained, created momentum because it guaranteed discovery and outrage, and in that scenario I would be the one to end it, the one to carry the anger, while she stepped into the role of the flawed but forgiven woman who had been pushed too far. Hearing her articulate it so plainly reframed every choice she had made, every calculated distance and manufactured tension, and I understood then that the affair hadn't been about desire or escape, but about engineering an ending that protected her self-image. That realization landed harder than the betrayal itself, because it stripped away the illusion that we had been drifting apart organically, revealing instead a strategy that used my trust as leverage against me. When the call ended, I sat in the dark for a long time replaying her words, feeling something settle that wasn't rage but clarity, because the narrative I had been reacting to was never accidental. The revenge I carried out had exposed an affair, but this truth exposed the architecture beneath it, and in that understanding I felt the final thread of attachment loosen, because there was no longer a shared history to mourn, only a role I had unknowingly been cast in and had finally stepped out of on my own terms. Knowing the truth about why she cheated didn't ignite another wave of anger so much as it flattened everything into a quiet, brutal clarity, because once you understand that you were maneuvered into the role of villain for someone else's comfort, outrage feels almost redundant. The choice in front of me wasn't dramatic or cinematic, and there was no moment where I stood in front of a mirror delivering a speech to myself about dignity or revenge, because the real decision unfolded slowly in the space left behind after the story I thought I was living finally collapsed. Friends and family expected escalation, expected me to press harder, to extract something visible from the wreckage, and when they spoke to me about justice and consequences, I nodded politely while realizing that continuing the war would only keep me tethered to a narrative that had already served its purpose. My wife tried one last time to reshape the ending, approaching me with a softness that felt practiced rather than sincere, telling me in long, circular explanations that she had never meant for things to spiral the way they did, and that she was willing to take responsibility if it meant we could find some version of closure that didn't leave her exposed. I listened carefully, noticing how every apology still centered her fear of being remembered poorly, and when she asked me what I wanted now, her eyes searching my face for a reaction she could work with, I told her evenly that I wanted distance, not punishment, and finality, not negotiation. That answer unsettled her more than anger ever could, because it offered nothing to argue against and nothing to redeem. The other woman, the one who had stood beside me through the unraveling, sensed the shift before I articulated it, and when we spoke about what came next, there was an honesty between us that felt earned rather than urgent. She asked me directly whether I wanted to keep going, not just with the plan, but with us, and the way she framed it made it clear she wasn't offering herself as an escape or a prize, but as a possibility that required intention rather than reaction. I told her that what we shared had mattered deeply, that it had been real and grounding in a moment when my sense of self was under siege, but that choosing her now as an extension of revenge would only fold her into a story she didn't deserve to carry. She didn't argue or plead, and when she said that she understood and respected that decision even though it hurt, the sadness in her voice carried acceptance rather than loss, which made the moment heavier and cleaner at the same time. Walking away from both marriages in different ways forced me to confront the quiet question underneath everything, which was who I wanted to be when no one else was pushing me into motion, and the answer surprised me in its simplicity. I didn't want to be the man defined by what was done to him or by how effectively he struck back, and I didn't want my future to be shaped by reactions to someone else's manipulation, no matter how justified those reactions once felt. Choosing to step out of the cycle wasn't an act of forgiveness or moral high ground, but of self-preservation, because staying meant continuing to orbit people who only understood power through control. In the days that followed, I began untangling my life deliberately, handling separation and logistics with a calm that confused people who expected fireworks, and as each thread loosened, the sense of relief grew more tangible. There were moments of doubt late at night when the quiet felt too empty, when I wondered whether walking away meant surrendering some imagined victory. But those moments passed as quickly as they arrived, replaced by the steady understanding that the only victory left worth claiming was autonomy. By choosing not to continue the revenge story everyone expected, I wasn't letting anyone off the hook, but reclaiming the authorship of my own ending, and that realization settled in slowly and firmly, preparing me for a conclusion that didn't need witnesses or validation to feel complete. The ending didn't announce itself with drama or closure speeches, because real endings rarely do, and instead it arrived quietly through a series of small, deliberate actions that felt almost anticlimactic until I realized how permanent they were. Papers were signed without arguments, belongings divided without sentiment, and conversations reduced to logistics rather than emotion. And what struck me most was how little resistance there was once I stopped playing the role she had written for me. She tried once more to frame our separation as mutual misunderstanding rather than design, but by then the words passed through me without friction, because understanding her motives had already drained them of power. The marriage dissolved not in a courtroom or a final fight, but in silence, and that silence felt honest, in a way our last year together never had. Saying goodbye to the other woman was harder, precisely because it was clean, because there was no betrayal left to expose and no anger left to burn away the tenderness we had built in the wreckage. We met one last time without secrecy or urgency, sitting across from each other with the knowledge that what connected us had been real, even if the circumstances were fractured, and when she asked whether I was sure, I told her the truth without softening it, explaining that choosing her now would always be entangled with what we had survived rather than who we were becoming. She listened without interruption, the way she always did, and when she said that meeting me had reminded her of herself rather than rescued her from anything, I understood that letting go didn't diminish what we shared, but preserved it from becoming something smaller. We didn't promise to stay in touch or leave the door theatrically open, because both of us knew that some connections are meant to end intact, rather than stretched thin by nostalgia. What followed was a period of quiet rebuilding that felt unfamiliar but grounding, where mornings belonged only to me and evenings no longer required performance. And in that space, I began to notice how much energy I had spent managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. Friends asked whether I felt victorious, whether the revenge had been worth it, and I never found a satisfying answer for them, because what I felt wasn't triumph or regret, but release, the kind that comes from stepping out of a system that thrived on manipulation and denial. The satisfaction wasn't in watching anyone suffer, but in realizing that I no longer needed to monitor reactions or anticipate fallout, because my life was no longer tethered to the choices of people who had treated honesty like a liability. Looking back now, the title of this story feels misleading in a way that makes me smile, because I didn't take anyone from anyone else in the end, and what I took back instead was far more valuable. I took back my ability to choose without being cornered, my capacity to walk away without explanation, and my sense of self that had been quietly eroded by years of accommodating narratives that weren't mine. I didn't take her out of revenge, and I didn't keep her as proof of anything, because meeting her wasn't about replacing what I lost, but about seeing clearly what I refused to lose again. I didn't win by destroying anyone else's life, but by stepping out of a story built on control and writing an ending that belonged entirely to me. And in that quiet certainty, free from witnesses or applause, I finally understood what letting go was supposed to feel like.